of good clinical practice. So they are, why does it exist? What are these standards? Where did they come from? Then moving into the more practical aspects of applying those standards, so the setup, who's responsible for what approvals do you need, and any essential documents. Then really looking at some of the key aspects if you're going into undertake clinical research or a clinical trial, the process of informed consent, how you collect your data, the case report form, where have you got that data from, which is the source data, and then where do you actually enter that data, and then finally the safety reporting requirements that you need to undertake. That does not cover everything in GCP, good clinical practice, but it's the key elements that hopefully you will take away some key points today and then want to do a whole GCP training session. Okay, so the standards, why do we have them? Let me just go through all of those. So, we have these standards in order to make sure that we are doing the best by everybody that takes part in research and to safeguard the research subjects. We want to make sure we've mitigated the risk, so if everybody has understood their requirements, their responsibilities, the risk is reduced. And then we want to make sure we can actually report on the research that we've done, so it talks about the quality of the data and the outcomes that you can then report on. And obviously all of those added together, we end up with excellent research and good science. So back to the original question, I suppose, what is good clinical practice? This is a definition of what good clinical practice is. You can read it there, but I will read it out because it's important. It's the International Ethical Scientific Quality Standard for designing, conducting, recording and reporting trials. It's the word that is used within the definition that involve the participation of human subjects. Okay. So GCP was written with clinical trials in mind, but many of the aspect of good clinical practice in GCP can be applied to any clinical research that you undertake. So always use it as your basis for when you're undertaking research that involves humans. So how do we get there? There's the timeline. So back in 1947, after the Second World War, there was the Nuremberg Code, which was as a result of the Nazi war crimes and the trials that were undertaken as a result of the experimentation that was undertaken by the Nazis on prisoners of war during that time. It really focuses on the ensuring that people have given consent to be part of a research project, which really wasn't a focus of the trials that the Nazi regime was undertaking. There was some science, but there was no consent. Then it took a little bit of time, and then there's this documentation that came out called the Declaration of Helsinki. It's a short read, it's about 1 page, 2 pages at the most, of depending on the size of the paper, of information really talking about human rights and their right to consent to participation in research. If you have a clinical trial protocol, every protocol should have that in it. So then again, we get to Australian relevant. So these are all worldwide standards. The Therapeutic Goods Act in 1989, which established the Therapeutic Goods Administration, which administers and oversees all new medicinal products within Australia, and a legislation that new drugs need to follow, new drugs and devices would need to follow. The bit that we're talking about, and the bit that I'm going to concentrate on today, is this, there was a conference held to harmonise the way that clinical research and clinical trials is operated across the world, and a number of countries came together. I think it was in 1996, I might have that slightly wrong, it was around that time, to establish this standard, because every country was approaching this in a different way. So that was when it was first launched. It was not changed, and as I was in a conversation yesterday, until 2016, someone said, well, it must have been a really good set of guidelines to not have changed in such a long time. And that's true. They're very clear, they're very concise. They have just been recently updated in 2016 to take into account the fact that research is not just done by pharmaceutical companies, but it's also done by the people in this room, by doctors, investigators, investigator-initiated research, to take into account some of those key pieces of information that were not clear in that initial GCP. Within our home territory, we also need to, when we're doing any research involving humans, we need to consider the Australian Code for Responsible Conduct of Research 2018 and the National Statement on Ethical Conduct in Human Research, which came out in 2007. So they are essential reads for everybody in here, but again, I'm not going to go into detail about those. You need to please go away and make yourselves familiar with those. They should be links in your packs to those documents. So, as I said, the Therapeutic Goods Administration was formed under an Act in 1989 and is responsible for the regulation of medicines and medical devices within Australia. They also, in 1992, there was the National Health and Medical Research Council, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with in the room and out there in Webland, which was formed under an Act in 1992. So if they're formed in Act, they're legally required bodies, and the NHMRC is specifically required to issue guidelines for the conduct of medical research and ethical matters related to health. So the two last documents that I mentioned to you, the Australian Code for Responsible Conduct of Research and a national statement, were written by the NHMRC. So, just to reiterate, the national statement, which is the shortened version for the ethical conduct in human research, and the code, the Australian Code for Responsible Conduct of Research. There are two codes. There is an animal code also. We're talking about the human code. You need to be aware of. There's also the state and red territory guidelines. Okay. So there's never one piece of legislation that you need to follow or regulatory guidelines. So be aware of that when you're undertaking research. Specifically to clinical trials, you also need to bear in mind the note for guidance on good clinical practice that the Therapeutic Goods Administration has drafted, and they have made some amendments to the version 2 of the international standard, just to clarify what those things, some things actually mean in Australia and how you would apply them. And the clinical trials of medical devices, if anybody works on medical devices, has an actual ISO, an international standard that needs to be defined, which is transferring good clinical practice into an international standard. So within WA, all human research and experimentation conducted within WA Health, you need to have the World Medical Association guidelines, the national statement and the code, and then these additional guidelines that you would need to be aware of. There are some very good reads here, particularly the Australian Clinical Trials Handbook. If you've never run a clinical trial, it gives you some really good advice and practical tips on how to do that.
I don't know why it is not connecting to my headset.
I'm going to keep going.
I can still hear from the
attempt to get through. So there are 13, let's get back to good clinical practice itself. So there are 13 principles of good clinical practice. I've just highlighted some keywords here, but you can go away and read the full 13 principles yourself. Just to highlight where the focus actually is for good clinical practice. So we're talking about the ethical principles, and here you can see the Declaration of Helsinki is actually stated within those principles, and that we must follow any applicable regulatory requirements, making sure so going back to what I talked about risk earlier, trying to establish any foreseeable risks or inconvenience, and that the benefit of undertaking that research outweighs any weighs against the benefit to society, A trial should be initiated and continued only if those anticipated benefits justify the risks. You'll see those reflected in the code and the ethical and the national statement as well. We must consider the rights, safety, well-being of any subject or participant in the study, and that is the most important thing before you proceed. Whenever undertaking any research, there will be non-clinical data and clinical information that may have been produced already and that must support the proposed clinical trial. There must be scientifically sound, and there has to be a detailed protocol, and I'll touch on the protocol later. Compliance with the protocol is absolutely key, and that has to have been reviewed by an independent ethics committee and given approval and a favourable opinion to proceed. The medical care and medical decisions made on behalf of participants is the responsibility of a qualified physician or a qualified dentist. That's very important. Each individual conducting a trial must demonstrate that they are qualified by education, training, experience, and again, I will talk about how that is demonstrated later, and the informed consent must be freely given. Just a few more. The information collected when you undertake any research, and the amount of information you collect is quite substantial, and it needs to be considered very early on how you're going to record, handle and store that information, and that you can actually accurately report and interpret and verify that data. Confidentiality of records must be protected, and then the investigational products, so any drug or device that may be in the trial, must be in accordance with another good GXP, they call them, good manufacturing practice, which again is a very big weighty document that if you're involved in that process you need to be very conversant with. And then finally, any systems and procedures that assure the quality of every aspect of the trial should be implemented. So I think they're fairly obvious and common sense, but actually demonstrating and doing those things is very, very important. So I'm just going to quickly wrap up on the standards, because there's a lot there and there's a lot you would need to go and read and take in, but it does evolve and it does change. Like I say, GCP changed in 2016. Version 3 of GCP is now actually being under consideration also. So that's a quick turnaround for another review of GCP. There's no one single document that's going to provide you with everything that you need to know. You need to make sure you're conversant across all of those. And always be aware of what you need to be compliant with and any relevant laws, policies and codes of conduct. If you're not sure, try and find someone like myself that's in research governance that can help you and point you in the right direction. We'd rather be asked. Okay, study setup. So now getting into how we actually implement some of those guidelines. I like to look at it as a hierarchical way of managing your records. So at the top, overarching everything here is your good clinical practice guidelines. I've spoken about the TGA and the NHMRC and what they would require you to have in place also. From those guidelines and from the codes and the codes of conduct, you would then establish some policies on how you would do that, then how you're practically going to do some of those things in standard operating procedures. Standard operating procedures should be things that you must do. So if you're writing a standard operating procedure, you must be able to do it. Then the working practice documents and study-specific processes really relate to the practicalities of how you then implement that on the ground for a particular piece of research. And there may be some study-specific things that you need to do. You need to collect all your records, your evidence, put in something that is called a trial master file that I'll talk about later, and source documents and essential documents, which is a section within the talk today. So moving on to responsibilities, there are many sections within GCP, and I often refer to my GCP book, around who is responsible for what. So the sponsor is a really key term that people need to understand and know whether they are or are not the sponsor. So they are responsible for the initiation, management and finance of a study. They can delegate some of their functions to third parties, but they cannot delegate that responsibility. It's a really important point because I hear people say that, well, that's been delegated, but the responsibility is still with the sponsor should something go wrong. There must be agreements in place to show where those activities have been delegated. As I've mentioned, the clinical trial responsibilities with respect to GCP are extensive. They are all detailed in item 5 within the note for guidance of GCP. I'm just going to show a snapshot of those, but there's almost a section on each one of these. So you need to, and they reflect what I said right at the start and why are we doing and meeting these standards. So it's really about that risk management and quality management, having that medical expertise and oversight, design of the trial and management and the data and the record keeping. These themes come up again and again, that you've got the appropriate staff and people that are experienced on the ground to do the actual running of the research. Insurance and indemnity is something that as a sponsor is essential and something that me and my team ensure we have in place each time we undertake a clinical trial. That you've got the right approvals in place to start the trial, that it's been manufactured, packaging and labelled according to good manufacturing practice. There's a safety evaluation process of monitoring, auditing, inspection, which I will touch on as well, and that at the end of the study that you've written this all up into a clinical study report. These are all sponsors' responsibilities. Then we go down to the actual getting onto the ground and the principal investigator and the running of the actual research. You always have a coordinating principal investigator, and they have that actual overall responsibility for that research project across multiple sites. They will they will ensure that a project is submitted for ethical and scientific review for multi-centre projects. You could just have one site and one CPI. But for multiple sites, there would be also one and then a number of principal investigators. They have the ongoing communication with the Human Research Ethics Committee and passing on any outcomes from this to their fellow principal investigators wherever they may be located at sites, and ensuring annual progress reports are written and a final report is given to the HREC. Again, there are more than this. This is just a highlight of what the coordinating principal investigator would do. They would also then undertake any duties delegated by the sponsor. So, principal investigator has responsibility for the overall conduct management, monitoring and reporting of research at the site level. And they would also include annual progress reports and a final report to the Research Governance Office within that site, that organisation, and are ensuring that they have the right authorisations to undertake the research at that site. They are delegation and supervising people that are running the study and the study team. They sign off also to ensure that they are competent to work on that research, and that's probably the most important document that I'll talk about in a sec. Oversight and management of the investigational medicinal product. Now you may think that would be something the pharmacy would do, but they are actually responsible for that ultimately. And safety reporting, signature on any notifications from the sponsor. So that shows that they have oversight of what's actually going on that study at any time. So if you're on a clinical research study or a clinical trial, then you all have responsibility to make sure it's being undertaken to the safest standards and the well-being of the participant, and that if you've got duties that have been delegated to you, that you are trained and competent to do those. If you are not feeling that you have had the adequate training or competencies to do that, you need to say. If you are audited, it's a document that your training is looked at very thoroughly. Okay, so you need to get your approvals in place before you can start a study, and you cannot start until you have that favourable opinion from the Human Research Ethics Committee. And for clinical trials, you need either what is called a clinical trial notification or a clinical trial exemption from the TGA. and then also make sure that any clinical trial is registered on a well-known registry, and that would be the most relevant one to Australia and New Zealand. So the clinical trial notification scheme is, some of you I know in the room have done these, is a notification to the Therapeutic Goods Administration of the intent to conduct a clinical trial. They are not going to look at any of the scientific data, they are just being notified that it will be taking place. That responsibility falls to the HREC, which will look at the safety, the scientific validity and the ethical acceptability of that study. Apologies. So they are not reviewing any data related to that clinical trial. And nearly every trial that comes through, well, every trial that's in the last 6.5 years that I've been here, they have all been CTN trials. So once you have a CTN, it must be signed by the principal. There's an order in which these things have to happen. There's principal investigator and then the chair of the HREC, and then the person responsible from the approving authority. So that's the Research Governance Office, is ensuring that the site has given approval for that study to take place within their authority. The CTN form is then submitted to the TGA along with any notification fee, which is about $350, if I remember rightly. And they cannot commence until the trial has been notified to the TGA and you've paid your fee. So you cannot start until you've done that. Exemption, a clinical trial exemption, is very detailed. So you are really at this stage submitting all the information that you have about that product for evaluation and comment, and they will review everything, the preclinical data, any information from overseas, the proposed usage guidelines. These are far more detailed than they are often what pharmaceutical companies submit, rather than investigator-initiated for new drugs, etc., that kind of thing. And they're in the thousands of dollars. I think it's about 10,000 last time I looked for a CTX application. So you cannot commence in this circumstance until you've actually had written advice from the TGA and then all the other relevant approvals to commence that trial. Okay. So they're the key approvals that you need in terms of clinical trials. Now, your study protocol is a very important document, and it needs to be clear and it needs to have been approved by the Ethics Committee. It will set out all the specific procedures needed to conduct that trial and the data that you will collect, and that needs to be very clear, very specific, because it must be followed. Anything that's not followed in there has not had approval. Each protocol should have a signature page, and then that shows, and is a way of demonstrating that when you take on that clinical trial, you've read and understood it, and you can actually deliver on that particular protocol. When considering whether you can actually undertake the requirements of the protocol, you need to assess the feasibility, and that's the principal investigator needs to do that. Can they actually deliver on the requirements of the protocol? Do they have the participant population? Is there the right staff to conduct the study? Is there any specific equipment that's required that they don't actually have? And has there been engagement with other support departments to say, yes, we can support this piece of research? These things, if you ever do a drug trial with a pharmaceutical company, they will check all of this as well before they approve you as a site. So the investigational product itself, which again is a very specific term for drug trials. The principal investigator has this responsibility to make sure that the people are appropriately trained for that storage of that investigational medicinal product. And as I said before, there is usually a pharmacist, but the principal investigator is actually responsible for it. There must be systems established to document who those people are that have that responsibility, and that they've been trained in how that's managed, how that's stored, the distribution of that drug. So it covers all stages, from the receipt, from wherever it may have come from, and then if it needs to be returned or destroyed by the sponsor at the end. So it's a cyclical process. So again, everything needs to be in compliance with the protocol. You need to keep records of every stage of the process of where those drugs are, what's been done by who and when, the quantities, ensuring what went out you can account for, if any extra has come back. They often have batch and serial numbers, so you need to be checking those off against each other, in and out. Expiration dates are really important. Expiration dates for investigational products will be way shorter than anything you buy off the shelf. And once they are expired, they are no longer allowed to be used. So there's also then unique codes that are related, given to participants, and they're identified, and make sure that you are able to link the two, so you know who was given what. Just a little bit more on investigational products. So finally, as with every good system, you need to have documentation of SOPs and compliance, and those people that have been trained. Make sure any equipment that needs calibration has been calibrated. There may be a process of randomisation in these studies that you need to consider, and how is that being managed, and that if you have a blinded clinical trial, that everyone knows how to unblind a study in an emergency. So if it's a double-blind study and nobody knows what's a placebo and what the drug is, how do you, in an emergency, find out what they are actually given? In most cases, you treat worst-case scenario in that they were given the drug. Okay, essential documents. So they are essential, and they are those documents which individually or collectively permit the evaluation of the conduct of the trial and the quality of the data produced. So everything you do will be judged against these documents in terms of the quality of that trial. They must demonstrate compliance with the investigator, the sponsor and the monitor, and the standards of good clinical practice and all the other applicable regulatory requirements. Okay, so that is actually what GCP is expecting. So when we talk about good clinical practice as one guideline, and I know I've talked about all the others, good clinical practice expects that you adhere to the local requirements too. There is an excellent table of essential documents in GCP that you need to ensure you have collected before, during and after. If you follow that, you're in good shape. It shouldn't be underestimated how much those documents are, though. Even in today's digital age, it's still a lot of documents. So how do we organise all of these? I've lost my bin bag, where the cross is. It needs to be in a robust filing system. In the old days, I show my age now, everything was in ring binder files. Now these things are being transferred into electronic, what we call trial master files. Okay, so whatever you would have done in a paper file, you now would replicate in an electronic trial master file. And there are templates available out there to use, and the responsible and the principal investigator must keep a trial master file for each study, and as GCP refers to a trial master file for all studies, and just not only clinical trials. The PI sometimes will refer to their trial master file as a site file. So the trial master file is often held where that coordinating principal investigator is, with the coordinating centre. So it's the collection of documents which tells the story, and it has a beginning, a middle and an end. It's not a single file, it's a filing system as discussed, and it contains every piece of information you receive at site relating to a specific study. So that can include any relevant emails, because that's a document if any decisions have been made, letters, conversation between investigators and teams, so minutes of meetings, and any relevant correspondence and decision making. Okay. So we can split these documents into two areas. Those that are obviously that are non-participant specific, and then those ones that are actually related to the participant. So the non-participant specific documents includes your protocol, includes the approved documents that have come from HREC. So they're not actually got any patient details or participant details on, they are the approved unused forms, all your regulatory approvals, your delegation log, your CVs and GCP certificates, which is your record of everyone on the team and that they're trained and competent to do their work, any correspondence that you may have related to that research and that trial, newsletters. Often companies will send out newsletters to sites to give them an update on the progress of the study, any new information, really important information to keep, and then any safety reports that may have been raised as part of the research. Participant specific, you can then see, is really about when you're collecting that data, and it's really about that individual person, any of their actual signed consent forms and assent forms. You raise data queries on the data, so it's about that individual participant. Patient notes, as long as they are de-identified and they are relevant to any information within the case report form on serious adverse events, and any search lists that you may have for eligible participants. So, essential, so they need to be, this is very obvious, but it's worth stating, they need to be in a designated file, in a designated place, maintained by a designated person. So, and they then need to be archived for a recommended period of time, so you would need to refer to any of your local requirements for those periods of time. If you don't have someone that's designated to do this, then things can get lost. It's not my responsibility, well, it's actually everyone's responsibility, because this is, as I say, it's the thing that demonstrates that you have actually conducted that research according to your regulatory approvals and to the protocol. Safe storage is essential, and the physical integrity must be maintained. So bear that in mind when you are setting up a study. They often need to be in locked compactuses or files, and then protected from the environment, such as damp, mould, fire, pests, etc. That's particularly important when you send things to archive. I've worked on a study where we lost a lot of data due to fire at an archive facility. These things happen, but it's actually things you need to consider when you're choosing your archive facility. So you need to have space to store these documents, because it is often underestimated, and when we moved from our old premises to our new premises, it was a challenge to find secure storage for all these documents that were required. So there is a slight difference between the trial master file held at site and that held by the sponsor, and that the sponsor should never have any participant identifiable information. There may be some exceptions, but that would have had to have had research ethics committee approval to do that. Okay, so this is a very, very important document. The delegation of the duties log. So it's the only one where you will identify the individuals who the principal investigator has delegated specific tasks to conduct that research in accordance with that protocol. The PI is responsible for reviewing and signing that delegation of duties log for each study. They must be certified that they have enough evidence to show that they are competent to whom they are delegating, and that the person that has been delegated that has been informed of all their involvement and duties required of them. So these things are not signed in isolation. You sit down and you do this together. Then you need to have the evidence to back that up, so any CVs, GCP certificates, possibly job descriptions available for everyone on that delegation of duties log. Just a disclaimer, this is not GCP training that you would be able to use to demonstrate that you are competent in GCP. This is just an overview. So the key thing to remember, and it's something that will stay with me forever. If it's not documented, it did not happen. I have had a regulatory authority audit, and it was very obvious that as much as I may have been able to answer a question from my knowledge in my head, if I couldn't demonstrate that by a document, they weren't interested. So it's really important, even if you think it's not, probably best to make sure it's written down. Okay, have to speed up a bit. Informed consent. So it's a process and it needs to be voluntary, and you need to demonstrate there needs to be willingness to participate in that trial. You always have to document that willingness of that by a written, signed and dated informed consent form, which has had approval from the Ethics Committee. Some of the people in the room, you will probably be wondering about children and young people. I'm not going to go into loads of detail, but these are the specific requirements that you would need to refer to if you are undertaking consent in children and young people. And also, just if you go into private hospitals or any other areas, make sure you've checked to understand what their policies are around consent, assent, etc. So it's not a single act. It's actually a very important part of the process. I would suggest if you're ever doing it, don't ever do it on your own the first time. Watch someone else do it. Be very trained and competent to undertake consent. Consent is often in a stressful time for people, so you need to bear all of those things in mind. At that point, you are introducing the study idea, you are telling participants about that research, you're also giving them a lot of information, which is the participant information sheets, which documents what the research is. You're asking them to look at consent forms or assent forms if they are needed. And then you are then required to discuss a number of items according to good clinical practice. Now, that A to T is how many things you need to consider when you're discussing consent, so it's quite a lot. So I'm not going to go through every single one of them, but just things you need to consider. You always need to give people time to think, and we're all different, so watch how people react, and are they actually comfortable and confident? Have you given them enough time to think? Have they asked and answered all of their questions? Do you need to get further advice to support their questions? You need to get that agreement to proceed from the parent or guardian and child if that is required. Each consent form will have a statement, and next to it there needs to have an initial to say they've understood each of those statements on that form next to each statement. Then it needs to be signed and dated. And they need to sign them, date themselves, and nothing should be added by a member of the team later. You don't add the date. You need to make sure that they have signed and dated it at that time. They could be contemporaneous as well. Any of these forms, so complete the assent forms where they're appropriate. It doesn't stop once someone's signed a form. You need to then, every time they come back to a visit, make sure that they actually want to continue. Okay, and document their willingness to continue. People are very altruistic and they will continue to do research, so we need to make sure they are comfortable and confident to continue. Okay, it's a very whistle-stop tour of consent. So your data, very dear to my heart. Started my life as a data manager, so case report form is something that I think is as important as everything else. So it's printed, but more these days it's an electronic case report form, and it is the place that you collect the data required as part of the protocol in order to answer that clinical trial question. The data that you get and put into the case report form comes from something called source data. And source data is all the original documents, data, all of these things that are listed here that will be checked and monitored against the data to make sure that they match in the case report form. So you need to maintain adequate source documents and trial records that include pertinent observation for each of the site's trial subjects, Source data must be attributable, legible, contemporaneous, original, accurate and complete. Changes to the source data need to be traceable and not obscure any original entry. It's really worth spending time getting this right, because at the end of the day, this is the data that you are going to use to report on that trial. So if you don't put good data in, you're not going to get good data out. In an hour, I don't have time to go over all the responsibilities, but again, there's 2 sections within GCP that talk about investigator responsibilities and sponsor responsibilities. So both have a very key responsibility for collecting data. So this concept of source data, if you work with a pharmaceutical company, they say, I'm going to come to site and I want to do source data verification, and they are then looking at all the data that has been entered into CRF and make sure it's been transcribed accurately from the source. If they cannot match the data, they will query it. Every piece of information must be found in that source data. So you've got the original entry, which is in the patient notes, and then that's transcribed into the sponsor's data collection tool. So it's recorded twice, always. The only exception to that is when you hand a questionnaire to a participant, because that's them, they write that once. So it's just some practical tips, because when the data managers and statisticians get the data, they want to be able to interpret it as easy as possible, so help them out. All fields must be complete. If something is not known, you only ever say not known until you've exhausted all avenues. And it's often wise to explain why that is not known. If it wasn't done, why wasn't it done? And again, write a note. In every note you write in a case report form, you need to initial and date it, or there will be a time, date and stamp in an electronic form. So you need to explain those, make sure if it's handwritten that it's legible, and always write in black. That's just as industry standard. If you make a mistake, you just put a single line through it, you put your initials and you date it, and then you write clearly what the actual correct version, correct entry is. Never include an original entry, like by scrubbing it through or using whiteout. And then, as I say, initial and date every alteration. And the last bit, never use whiteout or post-it notes. Do not stick post-it notes into anything. They fall out and they get lost. Okay, protocol deviations. You can fall into 2 categories, so you either have minor or major. Minor protocol deviations are administrative dispatches from the protocol, so you're not affecting the scientific soundness of the research or the rights of safety or welfare of those participants. E.g., they could be follow-up visits that fall outside of a protocol timeframe due to participant schedule, so it's unexpected, not pre-planned. Blood samples are obtained close to but not precisely at the time point specified in the protocol. If you do that, either of those things systematically though, they will start to fall into a protocol violation. So they only need to be reported to a HREC if a significant proportion of participants are affected, because then you are then actually moving into a major deviation from the approved protocol or regulatory guidelines. These are serious, they compromise the ethical acceptability of the project and potentially affect the scientific soundness of the research or rights, safety, welfare of those participants. So failure to obtain consent, participant inclusion-exclusion violations, and any compromise to data integrity. The inclusion-exclusion participant violations are really important. You cannot give approval for someone to enter a trial that does not meet inclusion or exclusion criteria, ever. The protocol has been written for a reason, it's been approved. They're just not eligible. So, how How do we ensure the quality of the data? It's an ongoing process. Monitors will continually come to site and review the data, particularly for pharmaceutical-sponsored studies, and they are checking overall progress, and they are making sure everything is conducted according to protocol, SOPs, and any regulatory requirements. And so if they find any errors, they will query that with you at site at the time, and they will need to all be addressed. An audit is the next level up, and that can be at any given moment. They're systematic and independent, and they ensure the trial is conducted and recorded and reported properly, as you would expect, and in accordance with the protocol or sponsor regulatory requirements. Sponsors will often have an audit schedule, and they will audit certain studies across their programs. The highest level of ensuring data quality is an inspection, and these are by regulatory authorities. In Australia, that's the Therapeutic Goods Administration. But if you do undertake research outside of Australia with Europe or the US, they have the authority to come and inspect that research, although the countries do now have a mutually agreed standard. So they will do an official review of documents and facilities and any resources, and they are assuring correct conduct and compliant to the appropriate regulatory requirements. They come and they are allowed to access anything they want. So what is monitored? Everything that I've just talked about. Pretty simple, because it is actually that whole story that shows that you have been following that protocol, you've got the right approvals, etc. Okay, so an important way to try and meet this is to write a monitoring plan, and it describes the strategy, the methods, the responsibilities and requirements for monitoring a trial, and if you are the coordinating PI or site, I would recommend that every study has a monitoring plan. Okay, doing okay. So finally, you're still with me, safety reporting. Safety reporting is, sorry, jumping ahead of myself. I haven't seen all studies, and the data gathered in order to monitor the effects of that study and any interventions participants to ensure their safety. It's a really critical process in part of all research. It's important to learn that once practice or treatment becomes standard care, because all of that information is then fed into you, the leaflets you get in any drug that you would be prescribed. That's where that information comes from. So regularly you will get safety reports, and they're analysed with any other safety data that may be, study data, that's collected, to ensure that the benefits of any potential side effects with every treatment or practice and the likelihood of them occurring and the potential risks associated with them are carefully considered before being approved into standard care. Okay? This needs to be done very, very rigorously. How do we get this information? It's a part of the process that will be within your protocol, and you are seeking to understand from the participant how they are, and a series of questions at every visit. You collect baseline information right at the start from a participant, and then you are looking to see if anything has changed. Okay, and that would be a potential indicator of a change in safety or an adverse event. You must be aware of any concomitant medications they were taking at the start, because again, any change might trigger a safety event. You then record any of those medical occurrences as required in the protocol, and you collect data as appropriate and reported within specific timeframes. So I'm going to just run through what they are. So there's specific definitions. An adverse event is any untoward medical occurrence that does not have to have a relationship between the actual study or the treatments administered. An adverse reaction, however, you would see that there is an untoward or unintended response to a new the product under trial or its usages. And you record all those document details in the source data, and always check the protocol to make sure there's nothing in addition that you need to be reporting as an adverse event or reaction. Serious adverse event, we're going up a level. SAE is a specific definition within GCP, and it is always either results in death, is life-threatening, requires hospitalisation or prolongation of existing hospitalisation, results in persistent or significant disability or incapacity, or consists of congenital anomaly or birth or defect. So in order for something to be categorised as a serious adverse event, it has to meet one of those things. There may be additional requirements in the protocol, so check and see if they are required by the sponsor. That is the minimum, that's the definition. So an adverse reaction has the same definition, but then there is a clear causal relationship between the drug device usage of that to the actual event. We also then need to decide, understand, was it actually expected? As you would understand, clinical trials, it depends what phase you're in. I haven't gone into all of those details today, but has it been seen before? The sponsor will produce something called an investigator brochure, and it will detail all the clinical and non-clinical data related to that study. And you need to be very conversant with that document, and they will expect you to sign off to say that you are, and that will talk about any known adverse events. If it's not known, not consistent with the investigator brochure, it becomes unexpected, and people do not, that's not what you really don't want, an unexpected event. Because these are the ones that are closely monitored, and they are a combination of being serious, so meeting that definition of serious, they are related, you can see a causal relationship, and they're unexpected, so they've never been seen before. And as in the world of clinical research, we do like an acronym, so it's called a SUSAR, so a suspected, unexpected, serious adverse reaction. In addition to that, there's been some recent new guidelines come out from the MRC on safety monitoring and reporting in clinical trials and therapeutic goods. So please make yourself aware of those, and it includes a number of new definitions. I don't have time to go through all of those today because I've concentrated on the definitions from GCP. But just to tell you what they are, that you need to look out for, they are a significant safety issue or an urgent safety measure. So please make yourself familiar with those new-ish definitions. So when you're presented with an adverse event, you can go for a decision tree. Can you identify an adverse event? Was it serious, as per that definition? Was it attributable to the study, so therefore it was related, it becomes a serious adverse reaction? Has it ever been seen before, i.e. yes or no? If it was a no, it's unexpected, and therefore it becomes what is called a SUSAR. So reporting these is important. All adverse events must be recorded in a case report form. Serious adverse events need to have their own reporting form and mechanism, and they must be reported to the sponsor immediately upon knowledge of the serious adverse event within 24 hours. And with the guidelines and any of the requirements of the HREC or the TGA. All adverse reactions are both serious and unexpected, so the SUSARs, if they are life-threatening, unexpected adverse reactions, as soon as possible but no later than 7 calendar days after the first knowledge by the sponsor, must they be reported to the TGA, and then the follow-up with all information must be complete within 8 additional calendar days. For all other serious unexpected adverse reactions that are not fatal or life-threatening, they need to be reported no later than 15 calendar days of the first knowledge by the sponsor. That's a really important point, is the first knowledge by the sponsor, not the time when it happened, but within that time frame of the sponsor becoming aware of it. So this whole process is something called pharmacovigilance. Okay, so you have your safety reporting that I've discussed. All this information then gets put into an investigation brochure, which gets continually updated. And then when you get to, hopefully, a product that can be used and marketed, that information is then put into a product information sheet. If you are using a already licensed drug, you wouldn't necessarily have an investigator brochure. You would be using the product information sheet as your source of information as to whether something was unexpected or not. So the investigator brochure, as I said, it provides you with all the information that you would need about that product to date. Its safety, its effectiveness, its side effects must be read, must be understood before you decide to proceed. It gets updated every 12 months unless significant new information becomes available before then. You must provide that you have understood it by signing and dating the IB, investigator brochure, apologies, and a sponsor will track those. They will be documents that all have an individual number, and they will track them in and out because they often contain a lot of proprietary information. As I've said, if it was licensed, then you would use the product information sheet. So, with 1 minute to spare, that is my whistle-top tour of GCP. It's a lot of information to take in. If you do get the opportunity to do further online training, then do. Face-to-face sessions are often give you much more practical application of GCP if you can find one. So that's... Oh, sorry, I need to go to the next slide. So, these are the upcoming research skill seminars that we have. The next one is on the 27th of March. There's a little bit of a gap. And then the 3rd of April. So do come along to those if you can. Just before I wrap up, I just want to thank Alison, who is at the back. She has been a stalwart in making these seminars happen in the last 3 years. 3 years, I am right. And sadly, it's her last day, so we want to wish her well. Sue wanted me to pass on her thanks to you. So if we, before we do any applause, can we give Alison So I can take questions. If yes, I can. Sometimes the room's busy. If anybody has any? Yep. Oh, sorry.
I've just got a quick question about how often should we do, in terms of the online, the GCP training, what's the frequency that you would expect? Is it annually, every 2 years that you'd like us to do that?
Normally it's every 2 to 3 years, but the actual requirement is if there has been a change in regulation or GCP, you do it as soon as you can after that, allowing for those trainings to catch up. So make yourself aware of the change and then you can do the training when it's available. But it's normally about every 2 to 3 years. Oh, yes?
You mentioned face-to-face. When are these ever run? I haven't even known it to be online.
I haven't seen one. I haven't seen one for a while. I used to run them. They were a day, but I think it's something for the future we should look into, because online training serves a purpose, but the practical application is often covered more in a face-to-face training, and you can learn from others' experiences. Yeah.
And there's also a couple of online ones, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Some is quite, as you say, about 10 hours, and some are a bit briefer.
Yeah, and some cost nothing, and some cost quite a bit. So the Western Australian Health Translation Network, that's probably the one I would direct you to, and it follows this format. So it was originally based on the face-to-face training that I did a while ago, and has developed over time. And I think you can then do modules that, like, you can go backwards and forwards to it. Yep.
And they do let you know something.
Yep. Any other questions? No? Okay, thank you very much.